There was one mirror in my parents' house. One. A small square of glass on a nail by the washstand, no bigger than a man's 2 hands. And I stood in front of it the morning everything changed, looking at a face I was not supposed to think too much about. This is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I tell you the things that were never supposed to leave the kitchen. I kept that morning the way you keep a small thing in a drawer. I am going to take it out now. Before I tell you what happened 3 weeks before my wedding, what a man I had spoken to 4 times was allowed to do in my parents' sitting room with my own mother standing against the wall, I need you to understand how a girl is made ready, not for a life, made ready to be looked at and approved. In the old order, a marriage is not 2 people choosing each other. It is a match the families settle and the gamay blesses, and somewhere in that settling, the girl's body becomes a thing the community has an interest in. They had a word for it that sounded like care. I have a different word now. I will get to that room, I promise. But first, stand in the doorway with me and see how ordinary it looked. So before any of it, let me ask you to stay. Not to do anything, just to stay. The way I needed someone to stay back then, and no one did. If you are watching from far from Lancaster County, tell me where you are tonight, so I know this reached past the plain white walls. And tell me one thing, if you can carry it. Were you ever taught your body belonged to someone else before you were old enough to know it was yours to begin with? Some of you already know the answer. Stay with me. November of 2018. The morning of my wedding, before the light was fully up, I stood at that little mirror with a basin of cold water on the dresser beside me, and I did to myself what I had been taught to do. I checked. I checked that the part in my hair was straight, that not one strand had come loose from the bun, that the cap sat right, and the pins held it without showing. My hair had never been cut, not once in 19 years, and I wound it up the way my mother had wound hers, and her mother before her, and I looked at the line of the part in that small glass, and I made it perfect, because perfect was the only offering I had. I want you to understand that I was not vain at that mirror. Vanity would have been a sin. Hochmut, pride, the trapdoor under every Amish woman's feet. I was doing the opposite of vanity. I was inspecting myself for flaws the way you inspect a jar of preserves before you set it on the shelf, to make sure it's sealed, to make sure it would keep. That is the strange thing I have had to sit with. The first person who ever inspected me like livestock at a sale was me. In the gray light, the morning of my wedding, 19 years old. Down the hall, the house was already awake. My mother was in the kitchen, the wood stove ticking as it took the morning's fire, and I could hear my younger sister Rebecca moving the chairs, setting things right, because by noon there would be 300 people in the yard. Rebecca was 12 then. She watched me come down the stairs in the blue dress, and her face did a thing I did not understand at the time, a kind of awe with something underneath it. I understand it now. She was watching the next thing that would happen to her, walking down the stairs in front of her, and some animal part of a 12-year-old knew it. She is 19 now, the age I was that morning, old enough to be steered toward the same wedding I was steered toward, and I left before I could tell her any of what I am telling you. That is its own grief, and it belongs to a different day. The dark blue dress hung from a nail on the back of the bedroom door. We do not have closets. The whole of my life hung on nails. The everyday dress, the church dress, the apron, the black bonnet, and now the wedding dress, which was not white and had no lace and no ring, would be slipped onto any finger that day, because we wear the marriage on no hand at all. My mother had helped me pin it 3 days before to check the hem. She smelled of wood smoke and the lye soap she made by hand in the yard, and when she knelt at my feet with the pins in her mouth, she did not look up at me, and I did not expect her to. I had spoken to Jonas Lapp maybe 4 times in my life by then. 4. Buggy rides home from the Sunday singing, his hands quiet on the lines, both of us saying almost nothing, because there was almost nothing we were allowed to say. 2 chaperoned visits in my parents' front room, fully clothed, my mother's footsteps in the kitchen the whole time. He approached my father before he ever meaningfully spoke to me, which is how it is done, and I want to be careful here, because Jonas was not a bad man. Jonas was a quiet, serious boy 3 farms over, who had been handed the same silence I had been handed, and neither of us knew there was any other way to begin a life. We were 2 people being matched like a team of horses, and we both thought that was love, because we had never been shown what else love might be. Here is what I knew about my own husband the morning of my wedding. I knew his family farmed dairy 3 farms east of ours. I knew he was the second son, which meant the home place would go to his older brother, and Jonas would have to make his own way, which is part of why a hard-working wife mattered. I knew he held the buggy lines like a man who did not waste motion, and that his mouth almost never made it all the way to a smile. I did not know what he was afraid of. I did not know if he wanted me, the person, or only wanted a wife, the position, and I had no way to ask, because asking would have been forward, and forward was a kind of pride, and pride was the trap door. So I stood at the little mirror and made my part straight and got ready to be handed across. Let me pull back now and show you the machinery, because if I only tell you the room, you will think it was one cruel afternoon, and it was not one afternoon. It was the whole way the world was built. In our district, a jime of about 30 families, worshipping in barns and front rooms on the bench wagon's rotation, no church building, no electricity in the homes, a girl was raised from before she could read to be useful and quiet and yielded. There is a word for the central virtue they pressed into us: Gelassenheit, yieldedness, self-surrender. It is a beautiful word, and in a man's mouth it can mean peace with God. In a girl's life it meant something narrower. It meant you did not have a self to assert in the first place. To want something of your own was already a small failure of Gelassenheit. To say no was nearly Hochmut. So by the time a girl is old enough to marry, she has been practicing for years at having no preferences anyone needs to consult. And the Ordnung, the unwritten code of the district, the one that is never written down because that is the point, because a thing you cannot read, you cannot argue with. The Ordnung shaped every part of the courtship. Who you could ride home with, how long, with whom watching, when a man could speak to your father. The Ordnung did not say in words that a bride could be examined for suitability. It did not have to. It lived in the community's knowing, and the community knew that before a man takes on the cost of a wife, it is only sensible that the families make sure the goods are sound. You have to understand that nothing about it felt like cruelty from the inside. That is the thing I most need the English world to grasp. There was no villain rubbing his hands. There was a whole community that genuinely believed it was doing right by me, protecting the marriage, protecting the children that would come, protecting Jonas from taking on a wife who could not carry the load. They were thinking of everyone in that arrangement except the one being arranged. And the strangest part is that I agreed with them. I had been raised to agree with them. If you had asked me at 19 whether it was fair to be looked over before a wedding, I would have told you it was wise. I would have told you a man has a right to know what he is marrying. I had no other words in my mouth. The cage was the only house I had ever lived in, and you do not call your own house a cage. A wife's worth in our world was a thing you could almost weigh. Could she keep a garden? Could she put up the harvest? Could she run a household by hand? The wringer washer, the wood cook stove, 3 meals a day for the haying crews, 48 quarts of tomatoes canned in one furnace-hot afternoon. Could she bear children, and bear them young? Could she yield? My mother's whole standing in the game was measured by how well her daughters turned out yielded, and so, when the time came to make me ready, she was not only handing me over, she was being graded too. Her worth was on that table next to mine. I am using that language on purpose. The goods are sound, because that is what I was, 3 weeks before my wedding, standing in my parents' sitting room. I was the goods, and the question on the table was whether I was sound. There was an old woman in our district. I will call her Lydia, though that was close to her name. Years later, at a barn raising, behind the long tables where the women laid out the noon meal, she set down a tray of fresh bread and spoke to me without ever once looking at my face, the way our women delivered the things that could not be said straight. She said, "Child, the day they looked you over before your wedding, they looked me over before mine, and my mother before me, and not one of us ever called it what it was." She said, "We hand it down like a recipe," and then she picked up an empty tray and went back to slicing bread, and that was all. But I have carried that sentence for years. We hand it down like a recipe. She had stood in a sitting room too, decades before me, and turned when they told her to turn. So you see, it was never one room and one man. It was a line of girls turning slowly in 1,000 sitting rooms, going back further than anyone could remember, each one's mother against the wall, watching, having turned herself once. Now I will take you into the room. I told you I would. 3 weeks before the wedding, on an ordinary afternoon, I was called in from the garden. I remember there was dirt under my nails, and I wiped my hands on my apron in the doorway, because it seemed wrong to come in unclean, and even that, even worrying about my nails, was the training working. I came into the sitting room, and my mother was there, standing against the wall by the window with her hands folded at her waist. An older woman from the church was there too, a midwife of sorts, the kind of woman who was called for these things. And Jonas was there, in his good clothes, holding his hat in both hands, looking at the floor. A single kerosene lamp was lit, even though it was afternoon, because the room faced north and stayed dim, and the light it threw was soft and yellow and long, the way that light always was, the light I had grown up inside. I want you to hold on to that lamp, because the room was so quiet I could hear it. They asked me to stand straight, so I stood straight. They asked me to turn, slowly, so they could see that I was sound, that my back was straight, that I carried myself well, that I would bear the work and the children a farm wife bears. So I turned, and then the older woman asked me to hold out my hands, palms up, and I held them out, palms up, with the garden dirt still in the creases, and Jonas Lapp looked at my open hands the way a man looks at a piece of land he is thinking of buying, checking the soil, checking that it will yield. No one struck me. No one touched me in any way I will describe, and I will not, because the horror of that room was never in the body. The horror was that at no point, not once, did anyone in that room ask me how I felt. My body was the subject being examined. My interior life was simply not part of the evaluation. There was no place on the form for it. I stood there and turned and held out my hands, and I understood, in some wordless way I had no language for yet, that I was not a person being known. I was a thing being approved. And here is what undoes me even now, more than the turning, more than the held out hands. I wanted to pass. Standing in that dim room with the lamp hissing, the deepest thing in me was not anger. It was the hope that I was good enough, that I would not shame my father, that the older woman would not find some flaw, some softness, some sign that I would not yield, and send a word out into the Gamay that the Esh girl was not quite sound. I had been so thoroughly made that I stood there, wanting their approval of my own body, as if it were a gift they might withhold. They did not have to break me in that room. I had been broken into shape years before, slowly, with kindness, in 1,000 kitchen afternoons, and I walked into the inspection already wanting to be found worthy of it. That is what Gelassenheit had done. It had taken the no out of me before I was old enough to know I had been born with one, and my mother watched. That is the part I had to come back to over and over. My mother, who smelled of wood smoke and lye soap, who had carried me and fed me and taught me to can 48 quarts of tomatoes in an afternoon, stood against the wall by the window and watched her daughter be inspected. And she did not stop it. Worse than that, she believed it was right. When it was done, she nodded once, a small nod, the same nod she gave a sealed jar, and I knew I had passed. I had been found sound. I went back out to the garden afterward. I knelt down in the dirt where I had been, and I kept working, because there was nothing else to do. And I did not cry, because crying would have been a kind of pride, a refusal of what was good for me. The wedding went forward 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, at my father's farm. Nearly 300 guests, roast chicken and creamed celery and 7 kinds of pie, no music, no dancing, no ring. The bishop preached that a wife submits to her husband as the church submits to Christ. And I, who had been turned and approved like a heifer, stood up in front of all of them and said yes, because the word no had never once in my life been made available to me. There is a word for what that room was. My therapist gave it to me slowly, the way you feed broth to someone who has not eaten in a long time. She did not hand me a stack of words. She gave me one: consent. And then, weeks later, another: coercive control. A yes that is not a yes, because every other answer had been made unbearable before you ever opened your mouth. I sat in her office the day I understood that the yes I gave at 19 had been arranged years earlier in a sitting room with my own mother watching, and I had to put my hand over my mouth. I live in the city of Lancaster now. A small apartment, 1 bedroom, 20 minutes, and an entire world away from Gordonville. I have my own mirror here, a real one, a whole wall of glass in the bathroom that I still find too large, too honest, after a lifetime of one small square. The road that finally led me here did not start with a book or a brave decision. It started with a question. A woman named Diane, an English customer who bought my shoe-fly pie at the produce stand every Friday for 2 summers, tilted her head at me one afternoon and asked whether I ever got to choose anything just because it made me happy. No one had asked me that in 25 years. I did not have an answer, but the question went and stood next to that sitting room in my mind, and the two of them together started to do something I could not stop. And I will tell you the thing I am most ashamed of, because if I only ever tell you what was done to me, I am only telling half of it. Before I left, when my Annie was 3 going on 4, I caught myself one Sunday morning straightening her little cap, smoothing her dress, turning her by the shoulders to check that she was tidy before the worship. And there was a moment, half a second, where I looked at my own small daughter, and I was already measuring her, already readying her to be looked at and found sound. The recipe was passing through my hands, and I had not even noticed I was holding the spoon. That is how it works. That is the part no one warns you about. They do not need monsters. They only need mothers who were girls this was done to, who love their daughters, and who hand it down because softening it would mean admitting what was done to them. My mother was not a monster. I need you to hear that, because it would be easier if she were. She was a girl who turned in a sitting room once, decades before me, with her own mother against the wall. She passed me the only survival she had ever been given, and she called it love, because to her, it was the only love she knew how to give. And Jonas was a serious boy holding his hat, handed a script for being a husband, and following it the way he had been taught, who did not know, any more than I did, that there had ever been another way. The system is the thing. The system was always the thing. Not the people standing in that dim, lamplit room, all of us turning when we were told to turn. I still have in my memory that small square mirror by the washstand. I think I will always have it. But I look in a different glass now, and some mornings I make myself hold my own eyes there longer than is comfortable, because no one ever taught me my face was mine to look at without inspecting it for flaws. I am learning. It is slow. The muscles I was never allowed to grow are weak and they ache, but they are mine. If you were ever turned by the shoulders and made tidy and handed to a life you did not choose, I see you. If you ever stood in a room while the people who loved you decided your worth without once asking how you felt, I see you. If you grew up somewhere your body was treated as a thing to be approved before it was ever yours to live in, I see you. And if you are a woman who caught herself, one ordinary morning, about to hand the whole thing down to her own daughter, and it frightened her into being awake, then I see you most of all, because that is the moment the recipe can finally be put down. I did not have the word at 19. No one in that room had it, but I have it now, and I am going to say it plainly, one time, for the girl I was, and for any girl still turning slowly in a dim room tonight, while the people who love her watch and call it good. Your no is a whole sentence. It always was. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.